Today, we're going to unpack how the Cold War was felt in really different ways, even between the closest allies. You'll see how two nations, staring down the exact same threat, ended up living in two completely separate worlds of strategy, paranoia, and, yeah, a whole lot of anxiety.
All right, so let's get right into this question. On the surface, you've got the United States and the United Kingdom shoulder to shoulder against the Soviet Union. But, when you start to peel back the layers, you find that their own national priorities and internal pressures sent them down these remarkably different paths.
So our story really kicks off right as World War II is ending. The alliance that defeated the Nazis, the West and the Soviet Union, well, it's already starting to crumble. It's just shattering under the weight of all this suspicion and these clashing ideologies.
And this is the moment it all becomes official. This one powerful sentence from President Truman. It's part of what we call the Truman Doctrine. It did way more than just ask for aid for Greece and Turkey. What it really did was frame the next 40 years as this huge global struggle. It basically drew a line in the sand between the US-led free world and the Soviet-led communist bloc.
What's really wild when you look at this timeline is just how fast it all fell apart. Think about it. You go from the Yalta Conference in early 1945 to the Truman Doctrine just 2 years later. And in that short time, that shared goal of defeating Nazism, it was completely replaced by this new reality, containment, and that forced each country to figure out its own unique game plan for survival in a world that had suddenly been split right down the middle.
For the West, the thing that defined this new conflict, more than anything else, was the terrifying, world-changing power of the atom. Seriously, this nuclear shadow would dictate everything: military strategy, economic policy, even national identity, for decades.
In the US, this whole new reality led to a massive overhaul of its military and intelligence agencies. And this document you're looking at, NSC 68, it was the secret blueprint. It basically argued for a huge ramp-up in military spending and this aggressive policy of containment. The idea was to stop communism in its tracks, wherever it popped up, to counter what they saw as a Soviet plan for world domination.
But here's the thing. Being on a permanent war footing is unbelievably expensive. So when President Eisenhower took office, he brought in this new strategy called the New Look. The idea was pretty simple, really. Get more bang for the buck. Instead of paying for a gigantic, super costly army, the US would rely on the terrifying power of its superior nuclear arsenal to keep the peace.
And this gets us to a really crucial difference between the two allies. While America's nuclear strategy was all about economics, the United Kingdom's was driven by something completely different: prestige. See, after World War II, their empire was fading, and then the US shut them out of its nuclear secrets with something called the McMahon Act. Britain was terrified of losing its status as a world power, so they started their own H-bomb program, not just for defense, but to make sure they still had a seat at the big kids' table. So here's the point. While both of these countries were building up their defenses against the Soviet Union on the outside, they were also dealing with these really deep anxieties about threats from within. And for the UK, that threat was about to be exposed in the most shocking way possible.
And this story just perfectly captures the paranoia of the time. This guy, Kim Philby, he wasn't some low-level nobody. He was at the absolute heart of the British establishment. He was the head of the anti-communist section of MI6, all while secretly feeding information to Moscow. You can't make this stuff up. His betrayal exposed this massive, devastating vulnerability and basically confirmed all of Britain's worst fears.
All right, so let's shift gears a little, because this global conflict wasn't just fought by spies and diplomats, right? It had a huge impact on everyday life and politics at home. It created this sort of internal battlefield of ideas and identity.
For American leaders, the thinking was pretty straightforward. A divided nation is a weak nation. Things like social and racial conflict, they weren't just domestic problems anymore. They were seen as a national security risk that could be exploited by communism from the inside.
And you better believe the Soviet Union jumped all over this vulnerability. They would spread pictures and stories of lynchings and segregation all around the world, and they'd ask this really simple, powerful question: how can America call itself the leader of the free world when it denies basic freedoms to its own people? This propaganda was so effective that it actually forced U.S. presidents to connect civil rights reform at home directly to the global fight against communism.
This quote from a U.S. government report just says it all, doesn't it? The push for reform wasn't just about morality anymore. It became a strategic necessity. The fight for civil rights at home was now tangled up with the fight for hearts and minds all over the globe. It's a perfect example of how the Cold War reached into the very fabric of American life.
So there you have it. Two allies, one war, but they were driven by totally different internal pressures. Economic efficiency versus national prestige. The fear of racial division versus the fear of establishment betrayal. Now, the Cold War might be over, but that legacy of anxiety and the strategies they came up with to deal with it, well, a lot of that is still with us. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? How do these echoes of the past continue to shape our world right now?